The sea around the Aegean was calm at first, with silver light on the waves and warm wind moving over the islands. Fishermen from small coastal towns watched the water like they always had, trusting it to carry their boats and their families home. Far below that calm surface, though, something ancient was waking in the deep, dark places. Poseidon, lord of the sea, felt it before anyone else because every tide answered to him, and every current carried fear when fear entered the water. He rose from the depths with a strong face, long dark hair, and a heavy trident in his hand, and he saw that the ocean had begun to split open under the Aegean. This was not a storm, and it was not a quake. It was a cosmic rift, and it was draining seawater into the void. The mortal world would lose its coasts, the gods would lose their power, and if the tier widened much more, even Olympus would be dragged into empty darkness. Poseidon understood the danger at once, and he also understood the shame in it. He was the guardian of the sea, so if the sea was being taken, then the blame would fall on him first. That was why he moved fast, and that was why he went alone into the first broken waves, even as the sky above him turned cold and gray. On the highest shore near the ruins of old temples, Poseidon met two mortals who had seen the first signs of the disaster. One was Alex, a young man with brown hair, a ferry worker who knew the sea routes better than any map. He wanted to keep his people safe because his home village would be lost if the coast failed. The other was Sarah, a woman with black hair, a temple keeper who studied old stone records and believed the old myths still mattered. She wanted truth because she had found marks in the ruins that spoke about a seal under Olympus. Poseidon revealed himself to them in full, and they were struck silent, not because he seemed cruel, but because his presence made the air feel heavy and real. He told them the ocean was being pulled into the void by a force older than the temples, older than the cities, and older than the memory of the mortals who prayed there. Sarah showed him the first clue she had found, a cracked tablet with one clear warning written in old words beneath Olympus. A demon had once been sealed away by the first gods, and the seal had been guarded by the bloodline of the seas. Poseidon had never heard that last part before, and it made the problem worse in an instant. If the bloodline was the key, then someone had hidden a truth from him for ages. If the seal failed, the demon would not only rise, but command the emptiness under the world and use it to eat every shore. Poseidon clenched his trident and chose his next path. He would travel through the shattered sea realms that stood between the Aegean and Olympus, gather the lost force needed to close the rift, and find the truth about the bloodline before the void found the whole world first. The first broken sea realm lay beneath a reef of black stone where the water moved like glass. There, Poseidon found the guards of the deep turned against him, their bodies wrapped in dark coral and their eyes clouded by strange shadow. These were Titan-forged beasts, ancient creatures made long ago from storm metal and sea bone, meant to defend the borders of the ocean. Now they were corrupted, and they attacked anything that came near the rift. Poseidon raised a wall of water, but the beasts split it with heavy claws and driving force. Alex stayed behind a rock ledge and guided stranded sailors toward safety, while Sarah read the old markings on the stone and shouted warnings about the path ahead. Poseidon did not fight with rage alone. He watched the current, he listened to the tide, and he struck only when the rhythm of the water gave him an opening. One beast charged like a living ship, and he drove it back with a thunderous wave. Another rose with a crown of broken shells, and he shattered its shadow armor with the tip of his trident. Yet the deeper he pushed into the sea realm, the clearer the truth became. The void was not only draining water. It was feeding on fear, memory, and broken trust. Each time a beast fell, a whisper followed, and the whisper carried the same name in a voice like dry stone thorn. Poseidon had not yet seen this name before, but the sea itself seemed to hate it. Then came the second revelation, sharper than any blade. Sarah found the hidden chamber in the reef and uncovered a seal stone bearing the mark of Poseidon blood, which meant the ancient ward beneath Olympus was not powered by the gods alone. It was tied to his own line, his own forgotten family, and that meant his missing blood heir had to be somewhere near the center of the truth. Poseidon had guarded seas for ages, yet someone had kept this part of his own history hidden from him. The shame of that hurt more than the battle, because it meant the enemy had not only attacked the world, the enemy had stolen his past. By the time they reached the shattered route toward Olympus, the sky had become a storm field of broken light, and the sea below was full of empty gaps where water had already vanished. Islands leaned like cracked teeth above the waves, and every mile felt like a wound. Thorn revealed himself at last in a ruined watchtower above the cliffs, a tall man with pale gray hair, sharp eyes, and a dark robe lined with silver fire. He was the one directing the void through the rift, and his motive was clear as soon as he spoke. Long ago, the gods and titans had sealed his master, the ancient demon under Olympus, but the seal demanded divine power to remain shut. Thorn had learned that if he drained the ocean dry, the bloodline of the seas would weaken, the seal would fracture, and the demon would wake free. He wanted that because the demon had promised him dominion over the empty world that would remain after the oceans were gone. Thorn did not care if mortals drowned or if Olympus fell. He wanted a new order, one ruled by the void, where only his chosen servants would survive. Poseidon answered him with a storm that shook the tower from its roots. Lightning split the clouds, rain struck like thrown spears, and the ground itself trembled as the sea rose in defense of its master. But Thorn had prepared for this. He unleashed another Titan-forged beast, larger than the others, with arms like oars and a chest covered in cursed plates. Alex and Sarah were forced to run as the monster crashed through stone and spray, and for one brutal moment, even Poseidon was driven back. Then Sarah made the third discovery, and it changed everything. The bloodline of the seas was not only a line of birth, it was a living vow, passed through heirs chosen to carry the sea seal when the gods were too distant to see. Poseidon had a hidden heir among the mortals, someone Thorn had failed to find because the child had been hidden away for protection. That meant the final seal might still be restored if Poseidon could reach Olympus before the void broke open completely. He looked at Sarah and Alex, and in them he saw what he had missed for too long. The sea was not only his kingdom, it was a duty shared with those he had once ignored. For the first time, Poseidon did not speak like a lone ruler. He spoke like a protector, and he asked them to trust him as allies, not as followers. At the edge of Olympus, where marble roads cracked into open darkness, the final battle began under a sky full of falling storm light. The rift had widened into a great wound beneath the mountain, and from it rose the ancient demon, huge and half-seen, with black wings made of smoke and a voice that sounded like many empty rooms speaking at once. It reached for the heavens, and every pull of its hand made the world shudder. Poseidon stood before it with his trident raised, his face hard, but his heart changed from the start of the journey. He now knew the true cost, and he knew the people depending on him. Sarah revealed the hidden heir at last, a quiet young boy named Luke, with blue-black hair and the calm eyes of someone who had unknowingly carried an ancient burden all his life. He was the bloodline key, and he had been raised among mortals so the enemy would not find him. Thorn tried to seize Luke and use him to break the seal forever, but Alex blocked the path and held him long enough for Poseidon to strike the ground and call every living current left in the sea. The water rose from every shore at once, moving through the air like shining chains, and it wrapped around the demon, slowing its reach. Yet the void pushed back hard, and the sky itself began to split. Poseidon understood then that force alone would not win. The seal needed blood, truth, and trust. He placed his own hand over Luke, accepted the line he had forgotten, and let the old vow awaken through them both. The ocean answered with a roar that shook Olympus, and the demon was forced down into the rift as the seal began to reform. Thorn screamed in fury and vanished into the dark below, but the void did not fully close. Poseidon held the line with all his strength, and the sea obeyed him like never before. The rift narrowed, the heavens steadied, and the mortal shores were saved for now. Yet as the last waves settled, Poseidon looked into the dark crack beneath Olympus and saw one final sign that the war was not over. Somewhere deep below, something far older than Thorn had opened one eye and noticed him. Poseidon did not retreat. He stood with Luke, Alex, and Sarah at his side, and he knew the next battle would demand even more than storms. It would demand the truth of the sea itself, and that truth was only beginning to rise. The sea was still, but it was not peaceful. Under the broken edge of Olympus, the water moved in slow waves of fear, as if the ocean itself was listening for a sound it did not want to hear. Poseidon stood at the front, tall and unmoving, his long dark hair drifting in the water around his stern face. His sea-green eyes watched the dark crack below the world, and his heavy trident glowed with a cold gold light. Beside him stood Alex, a young man with short brown hair and a worried face, keeping his feet planted on slick stone because he refused to run. Sarah, a serious woman with long black hair and a temple keeper dress, held her scroll straps tight and stared at the crack like she was reading a warning written in the sea. Luke, a quiet boy with blue-black hair and a small frame, stood between them, trying to look brave even while his hands shook. The danger was clear now. Thorn had lost the battle above the waves, but something far deeper had answered his attack, and if that thing fully woke, not even Olympus would stay safe. Thorn did not appear at once. He first let the sea tremble, then let the darkness gather, because he loved fear more than speed. When he finally rose from the black water at the edge of the crack, his pale gray hair hung wet and straight, and his sharp pale eyes looked almost pleased. His long dark robe clung to his thin body, and the silver trim flashed each time the broken lightning around the rift moved. Thorn was not acting without reason. He believed the sea should belong to one master, not to gods, mortals, and ancient seals that he called weak old chains. He had searched for the power below Olympus because he wanted to command every tide, every harbor, and every storm. He wanted control so absolute that no kingdom could stand against him. Yet even he had not expected what stared back from the depth. A massive shape moved behind the rift, half smoke, half horned shadow, with red eyes opening like burning coals in a buried furnace. Sarah saw the signs first and understood the truth faster than anyone else. The seal under the sea was not only holding back Thorn, it was also holding back an ancient demon, a force from before the memory of mortals, and Thorn had cracked the door wide enough for it to notice the world. Poseidon spoke at last, and his voice rolled through the water like a deep drum. He told the others that long ago, before the old temples rose, before sailors gave prayers to the waves, the gods had sealed the rift with a stone tied to his own bloodline. The seal stone was not a simple tablet. It was a lock, a warning, and a promise. It could only answer someone born of the sea line of Poseidon because the seal had been built from his power and his burden. Sarah quickly connected the pieces from her tablets and scrolls. She explained that the old sea symbols were not decorations, but instructions left by ancient keepers who knew the seal might fail one day. The rift under the Aegean Sea was not natural. It was a wound in reality itself, a place where the void pushed against the world and tried to swallow light, water, and shape. The water near it began to pull inward, and broken flashes of purple light flickered across the stone. Alex listened with a tight jaw because now the stakes were no longer just the mortal shores. If the rift opened wider, the void could spread through the sea lanes, tear apart harbors, and drag the coast into endless darkness. Luke looked up at Poseidon and asked the question everyone feared. If the seal broke, could they close it again? Poseidon did not give false comfort. He said they could, but only if they found the truth buried under the sea before Thorn used the rift as a weapon. The answer came with another shock. Sarah found a hidden mark on the seal stone, one that matched the sign on Luke himself. It was the bloodline mark of Poseidon, and it meant Luke was not just a frightened boy who had been carried into this war by chance. He was part of the line that could awaken the seal. Luke froze when he heard it, because he had spent his whole life thinking he was ordinary and small. Now the truth forced him to stand in a larger story. Poseidon looked at him with a hard and calm face, then told him that the sea had chosen him for a reason. Luke mattered because he could touch what others could not, and because the seal responded to trust as much as power. This was the twist none of them expected. Thorn had not only hunted the seal because he wanted its strength. He had also been searching for the wrong heir, believing the old bloodline had ended. He never knew that Luke had lived quietly among mortals, hidden in plain sight, carrying the final key in his own mark. That mistake had given the heroes one narrow chance, but it also made Luke a target, because Thorn saw at once that the boy could unlock the path below. Thorn attacked with cold fury. He lifted both black-gloved hands, and the water around him hardened into jagged dark spears that slammed toward the group. Poseidon struck back with his trident, splitting the attack into shards of light and foam. Alex moved fast, grabbing Luke and pulling him behind a stone rise while Sarah opened one of her scrolls and shouted the old sea words she had finally decoded. Those words did not make a spell, but they steadied the seal long enough to stop the rift from widening at once. Still, the ancient demon behind the crack pushed harder, and the whole cavern under Olympus shook with a deep, unhappy roar. Then the Titan-forged beast emerged from the flooded dark, a giant corrupted sea creature with armor like broken stone, dark coral growths, and glowing eyes that burned with obedient rage. It had once guarded the deep path, but the void had twisted it into a weapon. The beast crashed into the stone shelf, forcing Alex and Sarah to retreat as spray and shattered rock flew around them. Poseidon stood firm, his dark ocean cloak whipping behind him, and met the creature head-on. He drove it back with a spear of storm water, but the beast kept coming, strong and relentless, because the void had no fear and no mercy. The battle became a race against the crack itself. Sarah realized that the seal could not be fixed from the outside alone. The broken tablet had to be placed into the correct chamber beneath the rift where the ancient locks still waited. Poseidon understood the danger immediately because the path below would be narrow, dark, and full of pressure from the void. He ordered Alex to guard Luke, told Sarah to keep the seal words alive, and then made a choice that changed the shape of the group. Instead of forcing Luke to hide, Poseidon gave him the seal stone and asked him to carry it. That moment mattered because it showed trust, not just power. Luke, who had spent so long feeling small, stepped forward and accepted the stone with both hands. The glow from the tablet answered him at once, bright and steady, like the sea had recognized its own child. Thorn saw this and smiled for the first time in the fight because he thought the boy would break under the weight, but Luke did not break. He trembled, he swallowed his fear, and he moved beside Poseidon as the water opened a thin path downward. The way into the deep had begun, and the ancient demon below gave one heavy pulse that seemed to shake the entire world. Poseidon stared into that darkness and knew the truth was waiting there, not above, not behind, but far beneath the sea, where the oldest part of the war was only now beginning to wake. They descended together into the narrow throat under Olympus, while the rift glowed above them like a wounded eye. The water became colder, heavier, and harder to see through, and strange purple shadows slid across the stone walls. Alex kept close to Luke, ready to catch him if the pressure pushed too hard. Sarah read the oldest symbols with careful eyes, and each line she spoke made the seal chamber ahead seem less lost and more real. Poseidon led the way with his trident lit low, not as a king now, but as a guardian facing a truth he could no longer ignore. Thorn remained above for the moment, waiting like a patient knife, because he believed the deeper they went, the easier it would be to trap them. But the heroes had already learned something he did not understand. The sea was not only a weapon, it was a memory. It remembered the first seal, the first warning, and the first mistake that allowed the void to touch the world. As the chamber walls opened around them, carved with ancient sea signs and broken warnings, Luke felt the seal stone grow warm in his hands. Somewhere ahead, beyond the next bend, the final lock awaited. And somewhere even deeper, the ancient demon opened both eyes at last, as if it had been waiting for Luke to arrive before it made its next move.
The chamber opened wider, and the air changed at once, becoming colder, heavier, and full of old sea dust. Blue light moved across the carved walls, and every mark on the stone looked like a warning that had waited many ages to be read. Luke stood very still in the center of that strange glow, because the seal stone in his hands had grown warm enough to feel alive. He was a small boy with medium-length blue-black hair, fair skin, and worn earth-colored clothes.
The red eye beneath the lock blinked once, then widened again, and the whole chamber shuddered as if something huge had moved on the other side. The sound was low and deep, like a giant breathing through stone. Sarah stepped closer to the cracked seal stone resting in her hands, and the faint blue symbols on it pulsed in answer to Luke. She had spent years studying temple records, and she finally understood the truth that had been hidden inside the old sea stories. The seal stone did not work like a wall. It worked like a bond. It needed a living link, a bloodline mark, and a willing heart to keep the cosmic rift from tearing itself open. That was why the ancient priests had sealed it here. That was why Poseidon had guarded the chamber for so long, and that was why Luke had felt the lock choose him the moment he touched it. He was not only a helper now, he was part of the ancient seal itself. Alex looked at him with worry and respect because he could see that Luke was scared but still standing. Luke tried to speak, but his voice came out thin and shaky. He wanted to know if he had made a mistake. He wanted to know if there was still a way to step away. But Poseidon answered first with a deep voice that sounded like distant thunder. He said Luke had not made a mistake, he had made a burden. And now everyone else had to carry it with him. The ancient chamber under the Aegean Sea trembled like a living thing, and cold blue light rolled across the cracked stone walls. Salt dust drifted through the waterlogged air, the shell-glass lantern burned with a steady white glow, and every shadow seemed to lean toward the jagged rift in the floor. Poseidon stood at the center like a mountain above a storm, his dark hair falling over his shoulders, his sea-green eyes fixed on the wound in reality. Alex stayed near him with his weathered coat damp and tight against his body, while Sarah held her scroll case close and watched every carved symbol on the wall. Luke, small and shaking but brave, still pressed both hands against the cracked seal stone because he knew the seal would fail if he let go. Everyone could feel it now. The danger was not behind them. It was waking up in front of them, and if it broke free, the sea above would become a place of panic, ruin, and endless dark pressure. Thorn stood a few steps away in his long dark robe, his pale hair silver in the lantern light, his gloved hands calm and still. He looked proud in a way that made the chamber feel colder. For a long moment he said nothing, as if he wanted the fear in the room to grow on its own. Then he smiled with thin and careful cruelty. He had not come to help them save the seal. He had come because he wanted the void to open wider. He believed the old balance of the sea was weak, and he wanted to end that balance forever. In his mind, the world should not be ruled by ancient mercy or human hope. It should be ruled by power that never softens and never shares. That was why he had stolen old notes, broken trust, and fed the rift with pressure from hidden rights. He had waited for the ancient demon to stir, because he thought its coming would give him command over the fear of every kingdom below the waves. Sarah saw the truth first, and her face hardened as she read the carvings on the wall. The old sea marks were not warning signs alone. They were instructions. Long ago, the priests of the sea had not only sealed the demon away. They had also hidden a second lock inside the bloodline of Poseidon, because even divine force alone could not hold such a thing forever. The seal stone in Luke's hands was not just a broken tablet. It was one half of the last key, and Luke himself had become part of the lock when the sea marked him during the first battle. This was the reason he had been chosen. This was the reason the stone obeyed his touch. And this was the reason Thorn had been hunting him from the start. Thorn did not simply want the seal broken. He wanted the bloodline key turned the wrong way, because if the ancient demon rose under his control, he believed he could bend the sea chamber, the rift, and all the old divine doors to his will. Then the chamber answered him. The cosmic rift widened by a small but terrible amount, and the dark surface of the wound shivered like black glass under a hammer. Violet edges flashed. The void swirled inward. The shell-glass lantern flickered hard but did not go out. A low sound rolled from beyond the rift, deep enough to shake fear into the bones of everyone in the room. It was not a voice yet. It was a waking breath from something huge, old, and angry. The ancient demon pushed closer to the split in reality, and for one breathless moment its shape became clearer. Smoke like wings spread behind it. Red eyes opened inside the darkness. Broken horn shapes turned and twisted through a body made of shadow and broken mist. It was not fully here, but it was awake enough to want the chamber, the seal, and every person standing between it and the open sea. Alex stepped forward before fear could stop him, and that choice changed the room. He was not a great god, and he was not a trained priest, but he was steady in the way ordinary courage often is. He looked at Luke, then at Sarah, then at Poseidon, and he understood that they could not solve this by power alone. They needed trust. They needed the truth. He called out to Thorn and asked why he had done all of this, even after seeing the sea fight to protect him. Thorn answered at once, and his voice was sharp with pride. He said the sea had always been ruled by old limits, weak promises, and silent fear. He had found fragments of void lore in the deep archives, and those pages had told him that emptiness could erase weakness. He wanted a world where no one could threaten him again. He wanted command, not peace. He believed the ancient demon would obey the strongest hand, and he believed he could be that hand. Poseidon did not move for a few heartbeats, and that stillness was more frightening than anger. Then he lifted his trident of gold and storm metal, and blue sea light ran along the 3 points. He told the others that Thorn was wrong in the deepest way. The void did not build order. It consumed everything until nothing remained to rule. The demon beyond the rift was not a servant. It was a hunger that had learned patience. Poseidon had guarded the sea for ages, and he knew one simple law better than anyone in the chamber. Any force that fed on emptiness would always turn on the one who tried to control it. That was the hidden truth Thorn refused to understand. The more he gave the rift, the less he would own, until the darkness took even his pride and left him empty and afraid. Sarah looked up sharply at that, because now the betrayal made perfect sense. Thorn had not been tricked by the void. He had chosen it because he thought he could use it before it used him. Luke suddenly felt the seal stone grow warm, then hot, and the blue cracks across its surface began to glow brighter. He nearly dropped it, but Sarah caught his wrist and helped him steady the tablet. She told him the second lock had begun to answer his fear, and that the seal would either strengthen through his courage or split through his doubt. Luke was frightened, and everyone could see it, but he did not step away. He had been confused since the moment he entered this strange war under the sea, yet now he understood one important thing. The chamber did not care if he was small. It cared if he stayed true. So he closed his eyes, breathed once, and held the stone tighter. The glow deepened. The carvings on the floor lit in a ring around him. Ancient lines connected to the trident in Poseidon's hand and to the stone in Sarah's grasp, as if the whole room had been waiting for this exact moment. Thorn saw that bond form, and his face changed from pride into anger. He took one step forward and raised both hands. Dark currents burst from his gloves, thin and sharp like torn smoke. They struck the chamber walls and sent a spray of stone dust into the air. The shell glass lantern rocked in its holder but stayed alive. Alex shielded Luke with his body, and Sarah slid sideways to keep the carved tablet lines in view. Poseidon drove his trident into the floor, and a ring of sea force slammed outward, forcing the dark currents back by a full span. The chamber shook harder. The rift pulsed. The ancient demon leaned closer. This was no longer a quiet struggle of secrets. It was turning into a direct clash for the fate of the seal, and every second mattered more than the one before. Then Sarah found the missing piece. One of the wall carvings showed a second name in old sea script, hidden under layers of salt stain and cracked stone. It was not Thorn, it was not Poseidon, it was Luke. His name had been placed there long before he was born, written by the priests who served the sea because they had foreseen a mortal child who would carry enough trust to finish what gods alone could not. Sarah explained it in clear words, and the revelation hit the room like a wave. Luke had not been dragged into the seal by accident. He had been part of the design from the beginning. That was why the sea had called to him. That was why the seal had held in his hands. Thorn had been chasing a power that could never truly belong to him, while Luke had been chosen not for strength, but for faith. Luke opened his eyes, stunned and frightened, but the fear in him shifted into something stronger. He was no longer just the boy caught in the middle. He was the final link the chamber had been waiting for. Poseidon lowered his trident slightly, and his stern face softened by a small amount because he saw the change in Luke. He told him to trust the seal and trust himself. Alex moved beside him and placed one hand on his shoulder, giving him the steady support of a friend who would not run. Sarah began reading the last lines from the wall as the chamber lights sharpened into a blue-white circle. Thorn shouted at them to stop because he finally understood that the seal was no longer bending toward him. It was waking against him. He hurled one last surge of void force into the chamber, hoping to overwhelm their focus and break the line before it closed. The force slammed into the glowing ring. The shell glass lantern flared. The seal stone cracked a little more. For one terrible second, it looked as if the whole room might collapse into the rift. But Luke held on. Poseidon drove the trident down again. Sarah completed the final words, and Alex shouted for Luke not to let go. The seal answered. The rift tightened, but it did not close. The ancient demon cried out from beyond the black wound, and its huge shape pulled back only halfway. The enemy had been forced into retreat for the moment, but everyone in the chamber now knew the truth. They had won nothing permanent. They had only survived the first real push of the awakening. And as the lantern burned and the sea shook above them, Thorn stared at the living seal with hatred in his eyes, while Luke stood trembling in the blue light, changed forever and ready for the next part of the battle. The Aegean sea chamber felt colder after the enemy pulled back, even though the water above still shook hard enough to dust the stone floor with salt. The shell glass lantern burned with a steady blue-white light, and that light made the cracked carvings on the walls look like old faces waking up from a long sleep. Poseidon stood near the living seal with his trident lowered, calm on the outside and furious inside, because he knew the retreat was not the end. It was only the pause before the next strike. Alex stayed close to him, breathing hard in his weathered fisherman coat, because he had learned that courage did not always feel brave. Sometimes it felt like staying upright when fear wanted to drop you to the ground. Sarah stood a little apart, her dark temple keeper dress brushing the damp stone, and her sharp eyes moved from the seal stone to Luke and then to Thorn, because she understood records, signs, and warnings better than anyone in the chamber. Luke, small and trembling in his plain earth-colored clothes, stared at the blue glow that had wrapped around him during the clash, and he could still feel that strange change in his chest. Thorn watched the seal with open hatred, his pale gray hair hanging straight under the wet blue light, and his cold face made it clear that he did not fear the chamber. He feared losing control of it. That was the real danger now, because the First Awakening had shown everyone the truth. The cosmic rift was not just a wound under the sea, it was a hungry opening, and something ancient on the other side had noticed them. Poseidon turned first to Luke because the boy was no longer only a frightened helper standing at the edge of the fight. He was part of the seal now, and that made him important in a way he did not yet understand. Poseidon spoke in a deep, even voice and told him that the blue light had not been random. The seal stone had answered him because Luke carried a hidden mark from the old bloodline of the sea. Luke looked confused and scared, and Sarah stepped closer to explain what that meant. Long ago, when the old priests made the first seal beneath the Aegean Sea, they did not rely on stone alone. They tied the lock to living blood because a dead object could break, but a chosen line could carry memory, command, and warning. That was why Luke mattered. He had not been chosen by accident. He had been brought there by history. Alex stared at Luke with wide eyes, then at Sarah, because he had spent so long thinking this was a rescue mission that he had not seen the larger shape of it. Sarah then admitted something harder. The temple records she carried had never said the seal was perfect. They said it needed a watcher, a living link, and that if the link ever awakened fully, the seal would either become stronger or shatter from inside. That truth landed hard in the chamber. If Luke was the wrong kind of key, then the living seal could become a door. Thorn heard every word, and his expression sharpened because now he knew Luke was not just a boy in the way. Luke was the thing he had been waiting for. Thorn finally spoke, and his voice was smooth, cold, and full of poisonous certainty. He said he had not come to destroy the world. He had come to survive what was coming after the world changed. He believed the void was already winning, and he wanted to guide the ruin instead of being crushed by it. He wanted the rift open because he thought the old gods and old seals were only delaying the inevitable. In his mind, control was mercy. That was his lie, and it made sense in the worst way, because fear had turned him into a man who would break anything if it meant he could stand above the falling pieces. Sarah did not let Thorn keep the chamber with his words. She pulled one of her stone tablets free and spread the damp scroll beside the lantern, then showed the others a mark that matched the crack in the seal stone. Her hand shook only a little as she explained the hidden warning that the temple keepers had missed for years. The seal was not made to hold the ancient demon forever by force. It was made to bind the rift through balance. That meant the sea, the trident, the bloodline, and the living keeper had to stay aligned. If one part was taken for selfish use, the whole structure would lean and fail. Alex understood that before anyone else fully said it, and he looked at Thorn with fresh anger. Thorn had been speaking like a scholar, but he had the heart of a thief. He did not care about balance. He cared about ownership. As Sarah spoke, the chamber answered her with a low groan, and the living seal brightened for one sharp moment. A thin line of blue light reached from the cracked stone to Luke, and Luke gasped as memory flashed through him like a sudden wave. He saw not a dream, but a glimpse. He saw a much older chamber, dry and bright, with priests placing the seal stone into a ring of sea symbols while a figure in deep blue stood above them. Poseidon, not as a myth in a story, but as a real force, stern and watchful, making the first vow over the old seal. The vision passed in seconds, but it changed Luke forever, because now he knew the seal recognized the bloodline and the god who guarded it. He also knew something worse. The blue light was not only protection. It was warning him that the next pull from the rift would try to use him as an opening if he lost his fear. Thorn moved then because he realized the moment was slipping away from him. He stepped toward the seal stone with one black-gloved hand lifted, and the chamber lights turned harsher as the void behind the crack answered his intent. The air thickened, the stone floor trembled, and the far side of the black wound stirred with a deep, ugly pressure. The ancient demon did not fully emerge, but its smoke-like wings spread wider than before, and its red eyes burned through the darkness like twin coals. The Titan-forged beast also lurched in the shadow water near the far wall, its broken stone armor grinding as if it had heard a command. Thorn had been feeding the enemy little signs and hidden help for a long time, and now the truth finally showed its face. He had not only wanted control, he had been guiding the awakening because he believed the ancient demon would reward the one who opened the path wide enough. He thought he could bargain with the dark and come out above it. That was his real motive, and it was terrible because it came from pride, fear, and greed joined together. Poseidon slammed the base of his trident against the floor, and a ring of sea blue force pushed back the rising pressure. Alex rushed to Sarah and Luke not to fight alone but to keep them together because he now understood that none of them could win by standing apart. The chamber became a storm of light and shadow. The lantern flickered but did not go out. The seal stone cracked louder than held. The ancient demon roared from beyond the rift, and the sound shook dust from the ceiling. For a moment it looked like the chamber itself might split open, but Poseidon raised his trident and called a wall of water from the hidden channels around the stonework. The wave struck the dark force and drove it back just enough for everyone to breathe. Thorn staggered, but he did not fall. He only smiled, and that smile was worse than a shout because it meant he had expected resistance and welcomed it. Then Luke made the choice that changed the shape of the battle. He was still afraid, and he did not understand everything, but he saw what the others saw, and he understood that fear could not be allowed to decide for him anymore. He walked toward the living seal, even as the blue light surged around his legs and shoulders. Sarah called his name, and Alex reached after him, but Poseidon stopped them with one steady look. The god knew that some moments belonged only to the one who had to step through them. Luke placed both hands near the cracked stone, and instead of pulling away when the seal burned cold against his skin, he breathed through it. The bloodline mark inside him answered. The blue light grew bright, then steady, then strong. The chamber quieted in a way that felt impossible. The Titan-forged beast froze halfway through another lunge. The ancient demon pulled back behind the rift as if it had been touched by an unseen wall. Even Thorn looked stunned for one short beat because he had assumed Luke would break or panic. Instead, the boy held. The seal was not healed and the danger was not over, but the balance had returned for one thin, hard moment. Poseidon lowered his trident and looked at Luke with a new kind of respect because the boy had become a keeper rather than a witness. Yet victory still did not come cleanly. The seal stone remained cracked, the rift still breathed, and the chamber still shook. Sarah saw another line appear in the old symbols, and her face changed as she read it. There was one more condition hidden in the old text, one that even the temple had missed. The seal could not be fully restored from inside the chamber alone. Something else, somewhere above the sea, had to be brought into the right before the next surge. She started to tell the others what she had found, but the lantern flashed once, and a deep voice echoed from the black wound again. It was not a full attack this time. It was a warning. And everyone in the chamber understood that the next move would come soon, from either the sea god, the boy, or the traitor standing in the dark. The chamber below the Aegean Sea stayed cold and still, but the silence did not feel safe. Blue light trembled across broken stone walls, and the wet floor shone like glass under the shell lantern. Above that quiet room, the sea pressed down with endless weight, and deeper still, the cosmic rift kept pulling at the world like a wound that would not close. Poseidon stood near the center with his long dark hair falling over his robe, his sea-green eyes hard and calm, and his trident held low like a promise. Sarah stood beside the carved seal frame, her long black hair tied back as she studied every line with sharp focus. Alex, a young man with short brown hair and a worn fisherman coat, stayed close to Luke, because the boy with medium-length blue-black hair and small frightened hands looked as if one sudden sound might break his courage. Thorn watched from the shadowed side of the chamber, his pale gray hair and cold eyes fixed on everyone with quiet hunger. The problem was simple now and terrible. The seal could not be fixed from inside alone. Sarah had learned that a piece of the right had to come from above the sea, from the world of air and light, before the next surge struck. If they missed that chance, the void would spread wider, the chamber would fail, and the rift would swallow the old barriers that had held for ages. Sarah turned toward the others, her serious face set with urgency, and she began to explain what the carvings had shown her. The seal stone in the frame was cracked, but the old symbols still glowed in weak blue lines, and she traced them with a careful finger as she spoke. The rite was made in 2 parts, she said, her voice low but steady. One part belongs here, under the sea. The other part must be brought down from above, something linked to the surface and to the bloodline of Poseidon. Without both, the seal will only keep failing in pieces. Alex looked up at her with worry and hope mixed together because he wanted to believe there was still a real way out. Luke swallowed hard and stared at the black wound in the stone wall because he had already felt its pull once and knew it was not just a hole but a hungry force. Poseidon did not speak at first. He lifted his head toward the distant pressure of the rift as if listening to a voice only he could hear. Then he said in a deep and steady tone that the old gods had never made a seal to be easy. They had made it to be guarded by choice, courage, and truth. That was when the lantern flashed once. The light turned white, then blue, then vanished for the space of a breath. A deep voice rolled out of the black wound again, rough and ancient, and everyone in the chamber froze. It was not a full attack, it was a warning. The next surge was coming soon, and someone had to move first. The warning changed everything. Alex took one step toward Luke because his first thought was to protect the boy from whatever came next. Sarah straightened and reached for her scroll straps, already trying to form the next part of the rite in her mind. Poseidon tightened his grip on the trident and storm silver light began to gather along its points, small and sharp like sparks before rain. Thorn, however, smiled in a thin, cold way that made the others feel the air grow worse. He had waited for this moment and now his motive stood clear. He did not want the seal restored if that meant the void would remain hidden from him. He wanted the chamber to break because he believed the ancient power below the sea could be controlled once the barrier fell. In his mind, the rift was not a disaster. It was a door, and he wanted to be the one who opened it wide enough to rule what came through. He said little, but his eyes moved to Luke again and again because he understood something the others did not yet understand. The boy was not only frightened, he was connected to the rite in a way that had not been named out loud. Luke had a strange calm inside him, a quiet pull that matched the seal stone and the old symbols. Sarah had sensed it in the chamber and Poseidon had sensed it too, but none of them had spoken the full truth yet. Thorn knew enough to be dangerous, and that made the silence between them feel sharp. A strange tremor moved through the floor, and the chamber answered with a low hum. The carved sea symbols along the wall lit one by one, then dimmed, as if the room itself were breathing. Sarah stepped back from the seal frame and looked toward the upper tunnel, where a narrow shaft led up through the rock and toward the sea above. The missing part must be there, she said. Something was hidden where the air meets the water, something the rite depends on. Maybe a relic, maybe a stone, maybe a sign tied to Poseidon himself. Poseidon nodded once because the old records spoke of a surface mark that had to be carried down when the seal was renewed. It had been kept hidden for safety because if the wrong hand held it, the void would learn the path home. That was the second truth the others now had to face. The seal was not only a lock, it was a test. It required trust between the sea and the world above. Alex felt the weight of that truth in his chest because he had thought the answer would be a weapon or a fight, but now he saw it was a choice that had to be made before time ran out. Luke looked at the darkness and then at Poseidon, and for the first time his fear changed into focus. He asked a quiet question about the surface piece, and Sarah answered that they would need someone to retrieve it while the rest held the chamber. Before anyone could plan more, Thorn finally spoke. He said the upper chamber was likely trapped and only someone foolish or desperate would try to reach it. Then he added with cruel calm that perhaps the boy should go since the rift had already chosen him once. Alex turned sharply and his face hardened with anger. Poseidon did not raise his voice, but the pressure in the room changed at once because his silence felt more dangerous than a shout. The next move began before any of them wanted it to. A deeper rumble rolled through the stone, and the black wound in the wall opened just a little wider, as if the warning had only been a first breath. Shadow gathered around the edges, and the shape of the ancient demon pressed close in smoke and broken horn forms, its red eyes flashing once before vanishing again into void haze. The Titan-forged beast dragged itself into view at the far end of the chamber, its stone armor cracked and its dark coral limbs scraping against the floor. It had not come to attack fully, but to block the exit and cut off their choices. This was what the warning had meant. The sea was tightening its grip, and the enemy was testing who would break first. Poseidon stepped forward and planted the trident with a crack of light that forced the creature back half a pace. Alex pulled Luke behind a broken pillar while Sarah hurried to gather the seal notes she had written on wet stone tablets. Thorn stayed in the shadow, and for one brief moment, his stillness looked less like caution and more like planned betrayal. He was waiting for the first opening, the first confusion, the first chance to slip away or seize the relic before anyone else could stop him. Then the chamber shook again, harder this time, and a small passage near the upper shaft began to open under the force of the tremor. Dust and salt drifted down from above. Sarah stared at it and she knew the truth. The way forward had finally shown itself, but it was narrow, dangerous, and almost certainly trapped. Alex felt fear rise, but he did not step away. He looked at Luke and then at Poseidon and understood that being brave did not mean feeling ready. It meant moving while the fear was still there. Luke nodded once, small and serious, and that small nod changed Alex more than any speech could have done. Sarah lifted her chin because the missing piece of the right was no longer an idea. It was a real task with real danger, and she would not let the old seal fail while she still had a path to follow. Poseidon turned his stern face toward the opening above, and the sea-green light in his eyes grew stronger. He knew the rift was trying to force their hand, and he also knew the traitor in the dark was no longer hidden for long. The chamber had not fallen, but it had shifted into a new battle, one that would be fought above the sea and below it at the same time. As the lantern flickered back to life, weak but steady, Sarah began to move toward the upper shaft with her tablets held tight, Alex and Luke close behind her, and Poseidon bringing the trident up in silence. Behind them, the void whispered from the wound in the wall, and Thorn slipped one step deeper into shadow, where no one could yet see what he planned next. The path to the surface had opened, but the truth waiting there was still hidden, and the next part of the right had not yet been found. The upper shaft rose through cold stone and wet air, and the lantern painted the tunnel in soft blue light. Sarah moved first because she knew the tablets better than anyone, and she wanted the right finished before the chamber behind them collapsed. Alex stayed close with worry in his face, while Luke watched every shadow and kept his hands tight at his sides. Poseidon followed behind them, calm and stern, holding the trident like a promise that the sea itself still had a voice. Then the wall below them shuddered, and the whisper of the void turned into a deep, hungry roar. Thorn stepped out of the dark with pale eyes and a cold smile, and at last he revealed his plan. He did not want the seal to hold, because he believed the power under the Aegean Sea could be shaped and ruled by his will. He had followed them only to break the right, steal the seal stone, and open the cosmic rift wide enough to command the ancient force inside it. Sarah stopped on the next ledge and looked at the cracked tablet in her hands. The missing part of the right was not a chant or a symbol, but a choice of bloodline and trust, and only the true guardian of the sea could speak it. That was the twist that changed everything. The tablets were never meant for Thorn, and his own hunger had blinded him to the one truth that could close the wound forever. The shell-glass lantern flared brighter as if it knew the right answer had finally been found. Thorn called the ancient demon from the dark opening below, and the Titan-forged beast climbed after it with shattered stone limbs and burning eyes. Poseidon lifted his trident, and blue lightning filled the shaft while Alex pulled Luke behind a broken pillar, and Sarah placed the seal stone against the final mark. The right answered at once. The void screamed, the demon was driven back, and the cosmic wound began to shrink like a closing eye. Thorn reached for the seal one last time, but the current of the sea forced him away, and he fell back into shadow, ruined by his own greed. When the light finally settled, Sarah had changed from a keeper of records into a true protector. Alex stood taller, Luke no longer looked lost, and Poseidon watched the sealed chamber with quiet pride as peace returned to the deep.